Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn. It is September 12th, 2018. It's also the Season 9 finale. Tonight, Bill C-69, Canada's new environmental assessment approval selling, whatever you want to call it, the new regime. Goodbye, National Energy Board. Hello, Omnibus rewrite with too many empty blanks. A big promise of the Trudeau Liberal campaign in 2015 was a complete rewriting of the federal environmental review process. There's no question that the 2012 Canadian Environmental Assessment Act was a colossal failure, part of the infamous C-38. When you have entire panels of review agencies resigning over conflicts of interest, it's time to start over. The courts cancelled approval of Northern Gateway with just cause due to the flawed review process. As citizens began to really get in the way on Energy East, south of the border, Keystone XL was suddenly back on the plate. So, TransCanada Pipelines, which owns Keystone, said, yeah, we're good on Energy East, see you later. That's what happened to Energy East, but according to CAP and other big oil sycophants, Trudeau did it. Then Kinder Morgan, the Bricklin of the oil patch. Nothing says the existing system is broken better than the full stop put on TMX for the same issues that killed Northern Gateway. The badly needed replacement legislation, Bill C-69, has 412 pages, removes 2 acts from the books, establishes 2 new acts, and amends many more. You know what that's called? Omnibus legislation. You know, that thing that Trudeau said his government wouldn't do? It's about the 4th or 5th omnibus bill so far. The bill has been advanced through the House with time allocation twice. It has adopted approximately 130 amendments out of, well, I've got 320 in the show page, but it's more like 375. So that's 130 out of 375. It defeated 6 further amendment votes in the House, and it's gone on to the Senate, where things are definitely not as comfortable for the Liberals. What guaranteed failure of the old environmental regime were the regulations written to enable it? They delivered flawed processes with an unacceptable level of science, consultation, scrutiny, or diligence. It was written for applicants, not Canadians. And what progress has the government made on new regulations? Because the regulations define how the law works. So what progress have they made on them? Anyone? Bueller? The government always said they'd go in parallel with legislation and regulations. Well, the legislation is now in the Senate. It's 2/3 of the way to becoming law. Nobody has seen regulations for the new one. Well, the Prime Minister said no omnibus legislation on his watch. Well, Bill C-69 is omnibus legislation. Him and his ministry said environmental regulations would be developed in parallel. There's zero evidence available to confirm this. A shiny sales pitch is not proof of a good product. And there are many opponents from all parties, except the Liberals in the House of Commons, which, by the way, did you know, we have 5 parties now. So where is C-69 currently, and where does it need to get to until it can be taken seriously as a proper replacement? Well, I did a background on C-69. That was right about 6 months ago. That was Season 8, Episode 18. This is Season 9, Episode 16. So, yeah, it's about 6 months. Now, I'm going to start with a lot of stuff that the government has up online on their websites. And we're going to, maybe give a little additional clarification. So what is Bill C-69? Well, according to the government, every bill that the government puts forward has a legislative summary. It's a summary that says what it's going to change, what it's going to create, what it's going to eliminate as far as the laws of the land go. That's standard. So this bill first appeared in February. This is now September. Still no legislative summary up. So I will read to you what the government says. A legislative summary is currently being prepared for this bill by the Parliamentary Information and Research Service of the Library of Parliament. Meanwhile, the following executive summary is available. On 8th of February 2018, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change introduced Bill C-69. Here's the official title. An act to enact the Impact Assessment Act and the Canadian Energy Regulator Act, to amend the Navigation Protection Act, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. And it was given first reading at that time. Now, Bill C-69 Part 1 creates the Impact Assessment Act and repeals the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012. Among other things, the Impact Assessment Act A names the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada as the authority responsible for impact assessments. The regulator will no longer be doing the assessments. B provides for a process for assessing the environmental, health, social, and economic effects of designated projects with a view to preventing certain adverse effects and fostering sustainability. C prohibits proponents, subject to certain conditions, from carrying out a designated project if the designated project is likely to cause certain environmental, health, social, or economic effects, unless the Minister of the Environment or Governor and Council determines that those effects are in the public interest, taking into account the impacts on the rights of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, all effects that may be caused by the carrying out of the project, the extent to which the project contributes to sustainability, and other factors. Okay, well, let's back it up here. Prohibits a project if it is likely to cause environmental, health, social, or economic effects. Okay, that makes sense. Unless the minister determines that those effects are in the public interest. What? D. Establishes a planning phase for a possible impact assessment of a designated project, which includes requirements to cooperate with and consult certain persons and entities, and requirements with respect to public participation. Authorizes the minister to refer an impact assessment of a designated project to a review panel if he or she considers it in the public interest to do so, and requires that an impact assessment can be referred to a review panel if it comes under the activities that are regulated by the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, the Canadian Energy Regulator Act, the Nova Scotia and Newfoundland Offshore Petroleum Resources Boards. That's part of them putting it all under one roof. The reason there's a planning phase is because the timelines for assessments have been shortened. There we go. F, establishes time limits with respect to the planning phase, to impact assessments, and to certain decisions, in order to ensure that impact assessments are conducted in a timely manner. Provides for public participation and for funding to allow the public to participate in a meaningful manner. Sets out the factors to be taken into account in conducting an impact assessment, including the impacts on the rights of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Provides for cooperation with certain jurisdictions, including Indigenous governing bodies, through the delegation of any part of an impact assessment, the joint establishment of a review panel, or the substitution of another process for the impact assessment. That's an interesting one. They're leaving the door open that a province could actually do the one and only assessment, and the federal government would simply accept it. Or the door is open that they could let a First Nations organization do it. Unlikely, but it's there. Provides for the assessment of cumulative effects of existing or future activities in a specific region through regional assessments, and of federal policies, plans, and programs, and of issues that are relevant to the impact assessment of projects through strategic assessments, and sets out requirements for an assessment of environmental effects on non-designated projects that are on federal lands or that are to be carried out outside Canada. These are huge changes right there. In the old book, if the NEB or whoever you answer to said, no, you don't need an assessment, then that's it. You're clear. Nobody's going to come looking. Nobody's going to come checking. Now, if you're on federal land or federal jurisdiction, which at this point includes all Indigenous lands for the interpretation of this, with this new law, they can come check. So if you're breaking the law after you didn't need an assessment, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble. The other thing is, this will now look at effects of projects outside of Canada. The mining industry is not happy about this. There are a lot of things in there that are an improvement from the CEAA, as we'll look at as we move along tonight. A lot of that stuff wasn't there when C-69 first appeared. This has been fought for to be put in. And I think the Liberals have figured it out, especially with what's currently going on. People better believe that this is a strong improvement, or we're going to have problems. There are still a lot of loopholes. We'll get to them. But on paper, it is much stronger than Harper's Law. Part 2 enacts the Canadian Energy Regulator Act, which establishes the Canadian Energy Regulator and sets out its composition, mandate, and powers. The role of the regulator is to regulate, the exploitation, development, and transportation of energy within Parliament's jurisdiction. The Act, among other things, provides for the establishment of a commission that is responsible for the adjudicative functions, basically all the duties of the National Energy Board that it's replacing. Ensures the safety and security of persons, facilities, and abandoned facilities, and protection of property and the environment. Provides for regulation of pipelines, abandoned pipelines, traffic, tolls, and tariffs relating to the transmission of oil or gas through pipelines. Provides for the regulation of international power lines and certain interprovincial power lines. Provides for the regulation of renewable energy projects and power lines in Canada's offshore. Provides for the regulation of access to lands. Nice to say that. No idea what it means, especially with the feds just announcing a bogus First Nations rights recognition framework. That's garbage. This is going to tie in. Part 2 also repeals the National Energy Board Act. Part 3 amends the Navigation Protection Act to, among other things, rename it the Canadian Navigable Waters Act, provide a comprehensive definition of navigable water, and it's got the same things that were fought for under amendment in the other parts. It must consider the effects on Indigenous peoples, blah, blah, blah. Now you have to apply for approval on a major work in any navigable water, provide a process for addressing navigation-related concern in waters that are not listed in the schedule, blah, blah, blah. This is quite an improvement from what Harper did when he changed the name of the act and everything he did, which they're changing back, but it's not quite where we were before 2012. But it's an improvement. So what's the timeline been for this monster of a bill that is becoming more and more important in Canada every day when you look at what's going on with Trans Mountain, Site C, Muskrat Falls, Kiosk, Line 3? Well, the first reading of Bill C-69 was in the House on February 8th this year. It took 19 days, February 27th. Time allocation passed on debate after first reading. Second reading, March 19th. That's all that had to be done at that time. Read it and send it to committee. The committee report was tabled with more than 130 amendments on May 29th. Let me make it clear, that's 130 amendments that were passed by committee. There were 375 or thereabouts that were proposed in committee. And for some reason, about 98% of the amendments passed were put forward by members of the Liberal Party on the committee. Isn't that interesting? May 29th, it was read back in with the report. June 6th, time allocation again. Okay, we don't want to talk about this. Let's go. On June 11th, as the government was looking for what's called concurrence at report stage, which is a clearance of the second reading, there were 6 further amendment votes put before the House. All 6 were defeated by the Liberal majority. Concurrence was given on June 11th. Third reading was on June 20th, and it was shuffled off to the Senate. It passed third reading with majority. Your past amendments, too bad, shut up, vote up or down. Of course, it passed with the majority. It is now in the Senate as of June 20th. This is about 2/3 of the way to becoming law. Maybe more like 60%. But it's getting there. Now, as this has gone along since this process started back in 2016, the Liberals have been talking about, transparency, and this is our process, and this is what we wanted to do, et cetera, et cetera. We've talked about this before. When Harper was in charge, they just didn't give any information. Too bad. Never mind. Shut up. The Liberals have changed that, but a lot of it is waste of trees. They did put out something called the Better Rules for Major Project Handbook. This is like a discussion paper. This is a lesson about what they want the Impact Assessment Act to look like. And this was put out in February. This was actually posted to Service Canada's website on February 8th, 2018, the day that the bill was read. There's really been no update on it since. So, when we come across something that says regulations will do this, regulations will do that, what regulations? It's all the regular players that testify before the committees that aren't government. None of them have had any meetings for regulations. I'll give a little bit of their boilerplate off the bat so you get where they're coming from here. The government put in place interim principles for project reviews in January 2016, then launched a comprehensive process in June 2016 to review existing laws and seek Canadians' input on how to improve environmental and regulatory processes. These aim to address concerns about previous reforms to environmental assessments, loss protections for our fisheries and waterways, and the need to modernize the National Energy Board. The government has delivered on its promise by proposing better rules for environmental and regulatory processes. This milestone was informed by over 14 months of public, stakeholder, and Indigenous consultations, expert panel reports, and parliamentary studies. Canada is blessed with abundant natural riches. Developed wisely, major resource projects can power economies, support communities, and create jobs. Developed without proper oversight, they can lead to environmental degradation, stranded assets, broken trust, and lost opportunities. Ooh, scary. The only phrase there that the government gives a shit about is stranded assets. Improvements needed to the current system. More transparency and certainty that decisions will be based on robust science, evidence, and Indigenous traditional knowledge. More and earlier opportunities for meaningful participation by Indigenous peoples and Canadians. More Indigenous leadership of and partnership in project review. Impact assessment must look at all of a project's impacts to foster sustainability, including environmental, health, social, and economic impacts. More coordination with provinces to, quote-unquote, reduce red tape and avoid duplication. More predictable and consistent timelines. Project reviews should be rigorous, but they should also be timely. The process would be more efficient. Projects would go through an early planning and engagement phase, where project impacts and issues would be discussed with the public and Indigenous groups early on. This would lead to better project design and greater clarity for companies by identifying what is expected of them at the outset. The last line of their little statement about what this will improve: we have built on what is working in the current system and have put in place modern measures to protect the environment, regain public trust, strengthen our economy, and support reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Well, if you've built on what is working and you have to add those four things, excuse my French, what the fuck was working? In our consultations with Canadians, we also heard that federal project reviews should look at more than just environmental impacts. That assessment should foster sustainability in Canada. Going forward, we would expand project reviews to assess what matters to Canadians. The new process would assess a project's potential environmental, health, economic, and social impacts. We would also require a gender-based analysis for every review. This provides a more holistic picture of a project's impacts on communities to better inform decision-making. Now, of course, this made the news about a year ago now, and of course, everybody's forgotten about it. It's called GBA+, Gender-Based Analysis Plus. It is an analytical tool used to assess how diverse groups of women, men, and gender-diverse people may experience the same policies, programs, and initiatives. For example, a GBA Plus analysis would study how the influx of male workers in a remote work camp could affect women living in nearby communities. Now, if you ask me, having been in those environments, I have to say I think that's a pretty good idea. If you ain't been there, you ain't lived it, you have no idea. They go on to propose their new system. More efficient and predictable process. Now, this is one of the big things you have to understand about the new law. The key changes proposed to the environmental and regulatory system include shifting from environmental impact to impact assessment and improving the process. The goal of one project, one review with coordination with the provinces establishing a single agency responsible for assessments, updating the project list based on clear criteria, by the way, none of which exists yet, adding a new early planning and engagement phase, creating a more predictable and timely process based on science, evidence, public interest. Legislated timelines are maintained but reduced from 365 days to a maximum of 300 days for assessments led by the agency, and from 720 to a maximum of 600 days for assessments led by a review panel. For projects that are assessed by the agency, the minister would have 30 days to make the public interest decision or refer the decision to Cabinet. For projects assessed by a review panel, the Cabinet would have 90 days to make the public interest decision to determine whether the project may proceed. Now, the minister would have authority to approve exceptions to the timeline under certain circumstances. Well, the example they give is to align timelines with other jurisdictions. The bottom line is, out of all these timelines that are on the clock, there's one part of it where there is no absolute. When the applicant is getting their shit together for the first process, there is no time limit. That's not a change from the way it is now. Who would conduct impact assessments? A single federal agency would lead all impact assessments for major projects, whereas there were 3 before under 3 different processes. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency would change to become the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and be responsible for leading all assessments. This builds trust, reduces confusion, and ensures the approach is consistent. Yeah, I'm sure all these multinationals and utilities they just don't understand how the system works. Where do we send our paper? The agency would draw on the expertise of other bodies, like the Canadian Energy Regulator, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and offshore boards. So that's about the biggest difference here. Right now, the National Energy Board is the regulator and in charge of assessment. That's a problem. When a review panel is appointed, it will be the Minister of Environment and Climate Change who appoints them with time limits. Now, we get a little more, what's going on. What projects are assessed? The project list would be updated in consultation with stakeholders. We know what that means. The focus would be on projects that pose significant risks to the environment in areas of federal jurisdiction. This would be defined by regulation, which would be developed in parallel with the legislative process. As I said, this was posted on February 8th. It is still not happening. What is the project list? The project list identifies projects that have potential to pose significant risks to the areas of the environment that fall under federal jurisdiction. What is a life cycle regulator? A life cycle regulator, such as the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the National Energy Board, or the offshore boards, oversees the complete life cycle of a project. That is exactly why the Canadian Energy Regulator will not be involved with the decision and how things are built. What doesn't change? Life cycle regulators will remain responsible for regulating projects and assessing non-designated projects. Life cycle regulators would work collaboratively with the Impact Assessment Agency to provide expertise as needed. Now, in the key features, there's a lot of good things. There's a lot of things that people have been asking for. But saying them and doing them are not quite the same accomplishment. Proactive, strategic, and regional assessments would evaluate big picture issues: climate change, biodiversity, species at risk. It would also evaluate the cumulative effects of development and provide context for impact assessments. Again, this needs regulations. There are no regulations. The early planning and engagement phase for all projects would build trust, increase efficiency, improve project design, and give companies certainty about the next steps in the review process. Well, it depends how you want to look at that. Give companies certainty, yeah. The NEB was able to basically ban the public, when they felt like it, from impact hearings. With this early planning and engagement phase, some of these projects are going to have to go public before they go before a government agency. So, say if Kinder Morgan wanted to do TMX now, and the first thing they had to do is public engagement and produce a volume of data on doing that before the government would even listen to them. It would never happen. Is that a passing the buck, or is that just logic? I don't know. Indigenous engagement and partnership throughout the process. Increased public participation opportunities. I find that an interesting word to use there. Opportunities. Now, what are the results of early planning and engagement? Well, for companies, timelines, expectations, and requirements are clarified up front, ensuring that proponents know what is expected of them. Early identification and engagement with potentially impacted groups, Indigenous and otherwise, regulators, departments, stakeholders, and the public. The project design benefits from community input. If you take it at face value, it makes sense, because what they are pushing here is that with the early engagement before the regulator, before the impact agency will even see them, is they have to have this stuff. What do you want to build? And what have the people said so far? And what have you changed about your design, about what the people have said? That's a big change. But again, as I said, that step between starting the public consultation, whatever you want to call it, and before they go to the assessment board, that can be 5 years. That's the only part that has no timeline. Because until you get your file number or whatever, carry on. Now they're saying this will help with environmental protection. Potential environmental impacts identified early on will be much more evident. Okay, well, will they listen this time? Science and data scoped early with points of external review. That is a big change. There's a difference in the way they're going to accept outside studies, outside science. National Energy Board completely blew that. Project design is adapted early to identify issues related to the environment. There's also a requirement for the proponents, the applicants, to consider the best available technology to do what they want to do. That's open to very wide interpretation. For instance, if Site C had to go through this process, this impact agency would have asked BC Hydro, can't you generate this power some other way? Site C Dam did not even go before the British Columbia Utilities Commission because Christy Clark said they didn't have to. Her version of a Section 33. On paper, it is for the times. Now, what's the advantages for Indigenous people? Early and ongoing engagement. Impacted Indigenous groups are identified. The aim is to secure consent. Funding will be provided. Well, actually, it says funding available. Consultation planning with the government and the applicant. Consultation protocols developed, not developed yet. A comment opportunity on the project plan. They call that working together in partnership from the start. Input into tailored impact statement guidelines. And mandatory consideration of Indigenous traditional knowledge. What about for us settlers? Well, the public can participate in project reviews early on to identify issues to help shape the project design. Can provide input into the project plan. Process is transparent and designed to encourage participation. So what they want to do to impact assessments where they say that the most important things are sustainability and the public interest. What are the big changes? Well, it's a move from an environmental assessment to an impact assessment based on the principles of sustainability. Assessments would consider a whole range of potential impacts to understand how a proposed project could affect not just our environment, but also health, social, and economic issues over the long term. Assessments would also consider whether companies are using the best available technologies and practices to reduce effects on the environment. Every assessment would have to include an assessment of the impacts on Indigenous people. Included in the assessment must be both positive and negative impacts of a project. To anybody involved in the world of science, or elsewhere for that matter, that's how it is. With the National Energy Board, no. We only talk about the good stuff. Bad stuff? We didn't see that. Did you see that? I don't remember that. And they explained their decision-making process. Decisions based on robust science, evidence, and Indigenous traditional knowledge. Government scientists would review any studies provided by companies, and independent scientific reviews would be done when there is strong public concern or the results of a study are uncertain. Well, that's not treating both sides absolutely equal. Scientists will review any studies provided by the company. They're accepted. But if there's strong public concern, then there will be an independent review. They won't accept stuff that's already out there from the other side. They said they would make the science available to all Canadians, not just the experts, by providing plain language summaries of the facts that support assessments. What does that mean, though? Does that mean dumbing it down? Who decides what that plain language summary is? Who proofreads it? Is it accurate? Are there things left out? Again, regulations. Again, they don't exist yet. Indigenous traditional knowledge arises from and is inextricably linked to the land. It is an important knowledge stream and source of evidence in impact assessment and regulatory processes. It strengthens the rigor of our assessments and improves decision-making. It would be mandatory to consider and protect Indigenous traditional knowledge, if provided alongside other sources of evidence. Increase public access to science and evidence, blah, blah, blah. Oh yeah, they're going to create more positions. The federal government's chief science advisor would review the methods and integrity of the science used in making decisions. Again, it sounds like another executive position to, if necessary, deem something out of bounds. We will create an open science and data platform that would provide a user-friendly interface for accessing data related to cumulative impacts, impact assessments, strategic assessments, and regulatory processes. Well, guess what? Right now, if that started, there'd be 4 big empty folders. There are no regulations. There are no timetables for impact or strategic assessments. And what data to cumulative impacts? When you haven't done impact or strategic assessments, a technical advisory committee on science and knowledge would be established to provide expert advice to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada on issues such as research priorities and technical guidance documents. They try to answer questions here, but regional assessments would be undertaken to guide planning and management of cumulative effects, identify the potential impacts on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and inform project assessments. There are 0 guidelines in that statement. Strategic assessments would be conducted to explain the application of environmental frameworks to activities subject to federal oversight and regulation. No guidelines available. What would be different if the new rules are adopted? Well, of course, this is subjective, and we're back to the government boilerplate now. A modern, user-focused public registry would be developed as a one-stop shop for information related to projects and the impact assessment process. We've heard this from how many governments for how long? None of them have delivered. Increased project information would be proactively posted online. Increased. Well, you got like 2% now. What are we going to get? 6? Guidelines, regulations, participant funding programs would be enhanced to support the participation of the public and Indigenous peoples. This includes expanding eligible activities, increasing funding levels, and enhancing the process. They go on to spin a little bit about the Indigenous consultation part. You know, in a lot of ways, when you look at this and how it's developed as this has worked its way through Parliament this year, you might kind of tend to say that the Trudeau government knew exactly what the Federal Court of Appeal was going to say before it was said. Because how else could you just happen to address every single item? But they're the ones who, in January 2016, said, no, remember we said a brand new assessment? Yeah, no, that's just another broken promise. We're going to have a ministerial review. So we put a red rubber stamp on it. We'll own it. That's exactly what they did. Reconciliation must guide partnerships with Indigenous peoples, recognizing and respecting rights and interests, their deep connection to their lands, territories, and resources, and their desire to participate as partners in the economic development of their territories. Isn't it funny how the end goal for the settlers is always money? We recognize that reconciliation requires sustained government-wide action and needs to be at the center of all aspects of our relationship. So they're saying that the one-stop agency is better for First Nations and Indigenous people to coordinate Crown consultations for all federally designated projects. There is a legislative requirement to consider potential impacts on Indigenous rights and culture in assessments and in decision-making on projects. Mandatory consideration of Indigenous traditional knowledge alongside science and other evidence. Indigenous governing bodies would have greater opportunities to exercise powers and duties under the Act. That all sounds noble and all that shit. When they say Indigenous traditional knowledge, what they mean by that is stuff like sacred burial grounds, ceremony sites, things like that. Things that settler wouldn't have a clue about anyway, or give a shit. That is going to be recognized. And there's also a commitment that those locations, etc., will not be public, but they will be acknowledged within the process. This thing about getting them to be in on it, well, you know, I guess that depends on how you look at the way the federal government treats Canada's Indigenous people. If they're just looking for, no, I can't say that. If they're just looking for cooperators, shall we say, they're advertising an Indigenous Advisory Committee would be established to work with the agency on policy and technical guidance on issues of concern to Indigenous peoples. That's where you apply if you're, you know, one of those people. That's what they're pumping it as. But there's some big issues there that aren't talked about. And the biggest one that you're going to see if you bother to look into this in all through committee, through testimony, everywhere, the devil's in the details. It's these regulations. The reason that the National Energy Board was such a failure is because the regulations allowed for them to be biased, for them to lie. The regulations allowed them to ignore stuff, to exclude stuff, to forget stuff, to erase stuff. The regulations allowed that. That's what has to change. Where are the new regulations? Funny you ask. Everybody's asking. They did put out some more valuable paper, Approach to revising the project list. The purpose of this paper is to seek views on the proposed criteria to revising the project list prior to any formal changes being made to the regulations. This paper builds upon feedback received during the Canada-wide consultation sessions held over 14 months in proposing a criteria-based approach to guide the review and revision process of the existing list of projects. Following this first round of consultation, we will share a proposed project list for a second round of consultation. Discussions on the proposed project list will enable us to effectively engage stakeholders before entering into the formal regulatory process, where we would post the draft regulation for public comment and ultimately publication in order for the regulation to come into force. So, it's in the Senate. Where's the proposed project list? Nowhere. And then after that, it's going to go to stakeholders. And then it will become a formal process? When? If they try and pass this law without the regulations in place, this is not good. Because once it's law, they can do it or not do it or whatever. So this is the issue we're up against. The public interest determination will be guided by a project's contribution to sustainability, the extent to which these effects are adverse, measures to mitigate adverse effects, impacts on Indigenous groups and their rights and impacts on Canada's ability to meet its environmental obligations and climate change commitments. The government will be launching a strategic assessment of climate change in the coming months, which will lay out how climate change considerations would be integrated into the impact assessment process and determining whether a project is in the public interest. When? This will probably be given royal assent at the end of the year, as is the annual ceremony for legislation that gets through the Senate in the calendar year. So this is September. When is this strategic assessment going to be done? Like you can whip this up in a few weeks? The project list identifies the physical activities associated with the carrying out of projects. For example, construction of a mine or construction of a hydroelectric facility that may require an impact assessment. Each physical activity includes a description and in most cases a corresponding threshold, which serves as a representation of scale or size. For example, in the existing project list, the threshold is often related to the production capacity of physical activities. For example, a mine with an ore production capacity of 3,000 tons a day or more, or a hydro dam with a generation capacity of 200 megawatts or more. That type of thing. The government is developing a criteria-based approach to revising the project list that would focus federal impact assessments on projects that have the most potential for adverse environmental effects in areas of federal jurisdiction. Consideration of the full spectrum of positive and negative social, health, environmental, and economic effects will take place. The basic principle guiding the review of the project list is the potential for adverse effects. Okay. Federal jurisdiction will be central in reviewing and revising the project list. Under the proposed Impact Assessment Act, the government would consider projects that may have impacts on the following components of the environment that are within the legislative authority of the federal government. Fish and fish habitat. That's why we're seeing Part 3 of the Act to revise the navigable waters. Species at risk. Migratory birds. Changes to the environment on federal lands, including the lands of Indigenous peoples. Changes to the environment in a province other than the one where the project is taking place. Changes to the environment outside of Canada, and environmental effects arising from federally regulated projects such as nuclear, rail, ports, airports, interprovincial pipelines, and offshore energy activities. Okay, that's the best explanation we've gotten yet. We are considering areas of environmental importance, such as climate change, biodiversity, air and water quality, and protected areas. The following are areas with environmental objectives or standards to which the factors set out above will apply. Proposed areas include potential for direct greenhouse gas emissions above a defined level. Pay attention to that, above a defined level. Is that level defined? I don't know. You got any regulations? Potential for transboundary air emissions in another province or the United States. NAFTA. Potential for effluent discharge above a defined level into a water body. Potential for projects to hinder federal protection objectives in migratory bird sanctuaries, national parks, national wildlife areas, national marine conservation areas, and marine protected areas. Well, at least we're ahead of the states on that. Applying these environmental objectives and standards in the analysis could both influence the types of projects considered for the project list, but also the potential for creating environmentally based thresholds and entries in the project list itself. Consideration is being given to environmentally based entries that would encourage proponents to adopt best available practices and technologies early in project planning. Such actions could be taken into account when determining whether an impact assessment is required and subsequent scoping of an assessment during the early planning phase. If you want to translate that to the speak that goes on between the ministries and applicants, that's a way to skirt things. Be as green as you can possibly be. Maybe spend some of that money locally. It may help, but at least it's written down. The approach outlined would be applied to the existing project list as a starting point. References to the National Energy Board and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission will be removed going forward, as all projects prescribed in the project list would be assessed by the Impact Assessment Agency. The government will also consider amending, as appropriate, existing entries and thresholds in the current project list in light of experience to date. Yeah, you know what that means. And in consideration of environmental objectives and standards. The approach will include a review of existing entries on the current project list to confirm whether or not they warrant being subject to the new Impact Assessment Act. Potential new project types not on the existing project list could also be identified. For example, you wonder why Saskatchewan's pissed off. Example, potash mines based on the potential effects on fish and fish habitat, and large-scale wind power facilities due to potential effects on migratory birds and fish habitat in offshore. Thresholds and conditions for existing and proposed entries will be examined in order to ensure that the requirement for an assessment is aligned with the potential effects. For example, for hydroelectric generating facilities, the existing threshold could be reduced to now make smaller facilities tied to the potential for effects on fish and fish habitat. Alternatively, for tidal power generating facilities, recognizing the fact that small-scale demonstration projects are now better understood and have limited environmental effects, the threshold related to this entry could be increased. Kind of makes sense. Subsequent reviews. In recognition of the need to ensure the project list is functioning appropriately to support the impact assessment regime, following the coming into force of a new project list regulation, which, as far as anybody knows, doesn't exist, the project list would be required to undergo periodic reviews. The time frame for these periodic reviews would be processed in what? You got it. regulations. It's nice to have a process when there's nobody behind the door. Now, we take a look at the key factors for determining the potential nature of effects. Magnitude, the amount of potential change. That's going to be a big thing. Geographic extent, how much area does this project have the potential to affect? Timing, the potential nature of the effects using the timing given by the proponent. For example, if a project type has the potential for effects on migratory birds, then the analysis would consider whether the project type has the potential for additional effect during migration periods. Frequency describes how often the effect has the potential to occur within a given time period. Duration refers to the length of time that an effect has the potential to be discernible. And the reversibility, the degree in which the area of jurisdiction affected has the potential to recover from the effects. That is a little clearer than what we currently have. But again, it speaks a good game, but there's no playbook. There are no regulations. They put out another paper on information requirement and time management under this new regime. With this early session before you see the government and all this stuff, certain information has to be produced and modified and consulted and shown and posted. What decides what all that is? Regulations. Where are the regulations? Good question. Information requirements. The government is considering prescribing in regulations the information which the proponent must provide to the agency before and during the early planning phase. The information that the proponent would be required to provide would be in the two key documents the proponent is required to provide to the agency: an initial project description to commence the early planning phase, and subsequently following agency engagement with Indigenous groups, provinces, stakeholders, and the public, a document that includes the proponent's response to issues raised during the early planning phase and a detailed project description. The government is also considering prescribing in regulations the documents that the agency must provide to the proponent if it is determined that an impact assessment is required. Well, what's in this initial project description? All it really says is that it has to be accepted by the agency. The initial project description would form the basis for early engagement on the proposed project. It would allow potentially affected Indigenous groups, provinces, stakeholders, and public the opportunity to understand what the proposed project involves and if it is located in an area that could impact them. Well, I guess that would work as long as they were honest about it. I won't reflect upon that. Now, the second one, the proponent's response to issues and a detailed project description. The second document would be required to include two components: the proponent's response to the issues provided by the agency following engagement and early planning discussions. This could include issues that were raised during consultation in the early planning phase, as well as issues with respect to the proposed project that the agency considers relevant, plus a detailed description of the designated project. Again, what exactly is detailed description? Well, it's in the regulations. Timeline management. They're big on this. We're saving time. We're saving time. Well, they could, but they don't have to. Early planning has a total time of up to 180 days. The minister can request one extension for 90 days. The impact assessment itself, if a minister refers the project to a review panel, could take up to 45 days till that panel is established. Assessment by the agency could be up to 300 days. Assessment by a review panel could be up to 600 days. Once that is done, decision making, where the decision is the minister's, the minister has 30 days. Where the decision is by cabinet, up to 90 days. Throughout all phases of the process, proponents will remain in control of the timing for the submission of information that they are required to provide. So I just told you these shortened, mandatory timelines. Now, listen to what I just said. Throughout all phases of the process, proponents will remain in control of the timing for the submission of information that they are required to provide. So all the deadlines are on the public, on the indigenous groups, on the science panels. The proponents, you know what, get it to us when you can. Get this. In order to ensure that information for analysis and decision-making is current, proponents will be required to submit their impact statement to the agency within 3 years of receiving the impact statement guidelines from the agency. The agency would have the ability to provide an extension to the 3-year limit if a reasonable request is received from the proponent for additional time. So tell me again how the concern is the environment and economics and social and people. 300 days. Review panel, 600 days. Well, it's up to you guys. So shit, we'll give you 5 years. Now, I know I'm simplifying a bit there, which is not, 100% fair. But still, what is this? These guys want to spend billions of dollars and they can't get their shit together in 5 years? There may be circumstances in which the clock may need to be stopped for the legislated timeline, with the exception of decision-making. No extensions there. The criteria to determine when the clock for the legislated timelines could be stopped would be prescribed through regulations. The intent of these proposed regulations is to build in a mechanism where the clock can be stopped for legislative timelines to account for circumstances which might occur on the part of the proponent, the agency, the minister, or the review panel throughout the planning phase and impact assessment process. Do you understand what that says? It doesn't matter how many deadlines and clicking clocks we put on this, we can decide that none of that matters. To provide greater predictability and consistency. That's it. That's all this does. It makes a formal statement of how quickly things move, but we're not going to say that's going to happen. Now, public input on that closed on April 15th. The reason I bring that up, April 15th, this law had not come out of committee yet, so there was no report and no amendments. And this is when they were asking for input for regulations, when people didn't even know what was in the law and what wasn't. I'm not going to go into details about what must be in those documents that the proponent has to give, because it's just, they can just change anything anyway. They're a proponent. Don't worry about it. Now, as I said, it came out amended from committee at the end of May, and they accepted that stage on June 11th. It was in that time period that the government put out their latest shiny website boilerplate, Bill C-69 key amendments. We had some graphics and little drawings. Everything's going so great. Better rules to protect Canada's environment and grow the economy. Now, the thing about this is there are no details in this document. There is no indication of what in it was amended, what was not there before, none of that. This just gives you the final package when it was voted for concurrence at report stage. All you get is the product, not any details about what everybody bitched and had to be included. None of that is in here. It starts out typically like the government would. Cleaner environment, stronger economy. The Government of Canada has introduced legislation that would put in place better rules to protect our environment, fish and waterways, respect Indigenous rights, and rebuild public trust in how decisions about resource development are made. With these better rules, Canadians, companies, and investors can be confident that good projects will be built in a way that protects our environment while creating jobs and growing our economy. With these better rules, regulations. They don't exist. Developing resources while protecting the environment requires taking a big picture look at a project's potential impacts. Project reviews would consider not just impacts on our environment, but also on social and health aspects, Indigenous peoples, jobs, and the economy over the long term. We will also conduct gender-based analyses. Okay, that was all in there originally. Project reviews would consider how projects are consistent with our environmental obligations and climate change commitments, including the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. That came in committee, believe it or not. We would undertake a strategic assessment for climate change to provide guidance on how to consider greenhouse gas emissions in individual project reviews. That was strengthened in committee. The new impact assessment system would be more efficient and predictable, giving companies the clarity they need, and 5 years. Companies would have the option to opt in to the new system, and no project would have to go back to the starting line. See, I find that very interesting. So anything that's undergoing a review under CEAA right now just switches over to the Environmental Assessment Act. So there's a whole shitload more factors that are on the table all of a sudden. So I would think some of these projects, they'd be better to go back to the start, because then they can prepare everything and go by a different framework. If the National Energy Board ceases to exist, how are they going to take all the garbage from them and say, oh, look, you've got all these empty folders here? What's the point? And especially if they're getting their ass kicked at the National Energy Board, just kill that shit, we'll start over. See what happens. Project reviews would be rigorously managed to ensure that they are more timely. Yeah, unless a company takes 5 years or the minister says time out. Companies will know what is required from them at the outset, including what is required for Indigenous engagement. Will they? Do you think maybe the Indigenous people should know that first? A revised project list based on clear criteria would identify which types of projects would require review, offering greater clarity about how the new rules apply. Please check later for new rules. We would ensure that Canadians' views are heard from the start and improve participant funding programs for Indigenous peoples and the public. Comments would also have to be provided within a specified time period to ensure meaningful participation is balanced with timely assessments. Yes, as we've covered. Unless you are a proponent, then let us know when you got it. This has been an issue that a lot of people have been bitching about, especially when you consider this environmental impact part of the process. They're not taking into account issues of First Nations, such as harvest time, stuff like that. So, they time it when the government feels like it. It's halfway. Project decisions would be guided by science, evidence, and Indigenous knowledge. Project reviews would reflect our strong commitment to science and require federal authorities to exercise their powers under the proposed Impact Assessment Act in a way that adheres to the principles of scientific integrity, honesty, objectivity, thoroughness, and accuracy. Science and evidence provided by companies would be rigorously reviewed by federal scientists. That is new. Independent reviews would be done where there is a strong public concern or the results of a study are uncertain. It's also new. We would increase online access to science and evidence, including data on follow-up, monitoring, compliance, and enforcement. It's hard to say if it'll be an improvement because that simply doesn't exist now, for the most part, federally. Provincial regulators have been forced to do so over the last decade. A modern energy regulator has an essential role to play in ensuring access to safe, affordable, and reliable energy and guiding Canada's transition to a low-carbon economy. We will replace the National Energy Board with an independent new federal agency called the Canadian Energy Regulator. The goals of reconciliation must guide our shared path forward, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples will be clearly reflected in key provisions of the proposed legislation. That was in committee. There would be early and regular engagement with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of Indigenous rights and interests from the start. The decision to refer a project to a panel would have to consider the impact on Indigenous rights. New navigation protections would apply to all of Canada's navigable waters, covering our vast network of rivers, lakes, and canals. New modern safeguards would create greater transparency and give local communities a say in projects that could affect their navigation. Yeah, but not like it was before 2012. We are strengthening the protection of all fish and fish habitat for future generations. Legislative amendments would restore lost protections by protecting all fish and fish habitats, strengthen the role of Indigenous peoples in project reviews, monitoring, and policy development, and allow for better management of large and small projects that may be harmful to fish or fish habitat through a new permitting system and codes of practice, which sound like regulations which do not exist. Now, this whole bill has not been invisible to some of the press, but to the corporate press, to the corporate media, it basically has been. But the things in the press have coincided with different steps in the legislative process. Now, when it came out of committee, May 25th, Tony Seskus, CBC News, as Trans Mountain debate rolls on, Ottawa pushes to change rules for big projects. Bill C-69, unveiled in February, is headed back to the House of Commons after passing through the committee process, where debate heated up this week as opposition MPs argued the legislation was being rushed. We're working through this bill, and we know that despite best efforts by everyone around this table, we're not going to get through a proper review. Green Party leader Elizabeth May told the Environment Committee. Conservative MP Ed Fast went further. To short-circuit this by not giving this legislation the time required to get it right is, quite frankly, a disgrace. Liberals, of course, dismissed the claims, calling the accusation offensive and saying all parties participated in amending the bill. Key word there, participated. The debate isn't over yet, and this week's testy exchange might just be a taste of what's to come. The costs of getting this wrong are extremely high on all sides. Alberta Environment Minister Shannon Phillips told CBC News, on the investor certainty side, in terms of protecting the environment, in terms of Alberta and Canada's international reputation, you name it. Now, Liberal MP William Amos sits on the Environment Committee, said, that's what this bill is all about. It's about building the public's trust in the credibility of an assessment process when major projects are being evaluated. Now, this bill is bigger than a debate over any single project because it could shape the outcome of big projects for years to come. Members of Canada's energy sector have been vocal in raising concerns, largely because companies feel the bill could mean more uncertainty and less investment. The Canadian Energy Pipelines Association warned in its submission to the committee in the spring that it's difficult to imagine a new major pipeline could be built under the proposed act. Really? Gee, I wonder why. Executives have also expressed concern the bill does not address the high financial risks associated with lengthy reviews while still leaving the final say in the hands of politicians. Well, I'd say Kinder Morgan solved that problem. And though the proposed legislation sets timelines for the assessment of projects, both big and small, there are worries that getting to that stage might be a lengthy journey. Here's a spin from the energy sector. The oil patch also struggles with what it sees as an attempt to debate and resolve broader public policy issues. The Canada West Foundation, a Calgary-based public policy think tank, warned the regulatory process is not the place to decide government policy. Yet, in the absence of clear direction from the government on economic, environmental, and Indigenous rights policy, the regulatory system has become the de facto forum for debating these concerns. It is not set up to deal with policy debates, nor should it be. Others argue that energy development doesn't occur in a silo. Some First Nations communities, many of which made submissions to the committee, believed the legislation should build on a broader effort to recognize their rights. This is a signal things are changing. It needs to be stronger. Kluan Adamek, interim Yukon Regional Chief of the Assembly of First Nations and co-chair of the AFN Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment, said before the committee. When the federal government announced the legislation, one of the changes highlighted was that the impact of projects on Indigenous rights and culture would be considered early in decision-making. Adamek sees positives, but stresses the importance of including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, something the Environment Committee elected to add to the bill's preamble. Nicole Dusick of the Pembina Institute said the committee made some important amendments to the bill, including adding climate considerations to the portion dealing with the energy regulator. It basically means that all projects that are considered under the Canadian Energy Regulator will have to take into account climate considerations. It doesn't directly specify how that will be done. It just says that it needs to be done, which I think is fundamental. The legislation is just a framework, and it needs to be implemented. There is still a lot of work to be done. Now, after a cleared report stage, June 11th, Hill Times, Neil Moss. After an abbreviated committee study, 134 amendments, and time allocation, the Liberals' impact assessment bill was improved somewhat, say stakeholders, but is still a mess that was pushed through the House too quickly. It's a mess. Jamie Neen, Communications and Outreach Coordinator for Mining Watch Canada, said about the bill. What the government says they're doing and what's actually in the legislation doesn't really match. Mr. Neen said the bill was improved somewhat through the amendments made by the House Environment Committee, but they fell short. If you're going to look at a 400-page document, you need more than a few days. Mr. Neen said that everything from the expert panel consultations to the process itself has been compressed. When the bill first went to the Environment Committee, the Liberals limited the number of days that the committee could hear from witnesses, review the legislation, and debate any amendments. The committee heard from more than 50 witnesses and received more than 150 written submissions. As previously reported by the Hill Times, the NDP and Conservative committee members together put forward nearly 200 of their own amendments, and Green Party leader Elizabeth May put forward 170 on her own. Ms. May is not a member of the committee, but she can put forward amendments and attend meetings, but cannot vote. Among the amendments made, nearly all of which were Liberal proposed, were ones that sought to make sure that minister and cabinet decisions about resource projects adhere to the principles of scientific integrity, honesty, objectivity, thoroughness, and accuracy. These changes aren't enough, said Martha Hall Finlay, the president and CEO of Canada West Foundation. Of course, she's a former Liberal MP. She's a former Liberal Party leadership candidate. We are worried that if there aren't significant changes to it before it gets passed, it will have, in effect, been a rushed bill that is very flawed. She told the Hill Times that political calculations should be made early on in the process, and the regulator should have the final say on the assessment. If the politicians of the day feel that something is not in the national interest, then they should say so early, or vice versa. That way proponents know whether they should be investing their time and money or not. Well, there is a certain logic to that, is there not? Other changes made to the bill in the name of transparency include requiring assessment reports to incorporate a broader range of information, including a summary of comments received, recommendations on mitigation measures and follow-up, and the agency's rationale and conclusions, and making public comments made during project reviews available online. C-69 was also amended to clarify that project approval would be based on the impact assessment report, including all the other factors that the bill says it will take into consideration. Martha Hall Finley added, "This is so important to the Canadian economy. It's not just about pipelines. This is about getting any significant infrastructure built, not just energy, because the impact assessment proposal is for more than just energy projects." That's true. One regulator. The Senate could still make its mark on the bill, though Mr. Neen of Mining Watch said he didn't have any idea how the bill would fare in the upper chamber. There are some senators that are very conscientious and are actually familiar with these issues. And I know there are a lot of senators who aren't. It didn't take long from there, a big 9 days, until it passed third reading, June 20th. Now, I'll turn to an article by Patrick DeRoche, Program Manager of Climate and Energy. Bill 69, the overhaul of energy project review process, was one step closer to becoming law. It just does a little review. It's short. In 2012, the previous government gutted protections for Canada's land, air, water, and climate. While far from perfect, the new legislation, Bill C-69, is a notable improvement and could help restore public trust in government decision-making on energy projects like pipelines. So this vote is welcome news. But now Bill C-69 must be passed by the Senate, and the government must draft effective regulations to implement the legislation and fulfill its mandate to fix Canada's broken environmental laws. Bill C-69 makes some big improvements over the current laws and processes for reviewing energy and industrial projects. Goes through the points, centralizing all impact assessments and reviews under one agency, removing barriers to public participation, requiring the consideration of a project's contribution to Canada's climate targets, recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples and enhancing their role, expanding the scope of project reviews, and the commitment to a strategic assessment on climate change. Mr. DeRoche says these improvements will go a long way toward restoring public trust and credibility to the project review process. But there are still some significant problems with Bill C-69, such as the potential for high carbon projects, such as fracking and in situ tar sands, to move forward without a federal review. The failure to restore lost environmental protection to all of Canada's lakes, rivers, and streams. More authority for the offshore petroleum boards that regulate offshore oil and gas drilling in Atlantic Canada, which are widely seen to be hijacked by industry. Despite these shortcomings, the passage of C-69 through the House brings Canada one step closer to fixing Canada's broken environmental laws and restoring public trust. Now, when it left the House, I also have a statement from the Pembina Institute. Nicole Dusick, postdoctoral fellow at the Pembina Institute, made this statement in response to the House of Commons passing Bill C-69. The Canadian Energy Regulator Act demonstrates the government has worked to fulfill its mandate to modernize the National Energy Board and ensure robust and fair project reviews. The Act removes barriers to public participation, transfers authority for impact assessment to the Impact Assessment Agency, expands the list of factors that must be considered, and changes the governance structure to reduce the potential for conflict of interest. We were pleased to see important additions made to the CER Act at the committee stage, including the requirement to consider climate obligations in the review of all energy projects. As tabled, Bill C-69 introduced a number of provisions to enhance the role of Indigenous rights holders in project assessment. The committee rightly thought it necessary to take this a step further and reference the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, in all three parts of the bill. Going forward, it is critical that the Government of Canada works with Indigenous peoples to ensure the UNDRIP principles are fully operationalized from the earliest stages of project design through to decommissioning. Bill C-69 is an important piece of legislation, and the work is far from over. Key pieces of regulation that are still to be established will determine how effective the reforms ultimately are. We look forward to working with the government to ensure implementation measures are created to require an impact assessment for all major projects. So there we go. Proof more that these regulations that this law cannot work without still don't exist. On the same day, I turn to the Narwhal, article by Emma Gilchrist. Federal Green Party leader Elizabeth May and NDP Deputy Environment critic Linda Duncan shared a common response to the passage of Bill C-69. In a word, they called it appalling. It was really undemocratic. It is a total missed opportunity, said Duncan, who resigned from the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development over its handling of C-69. It was the most appalling process I've ever been through in my time in environmental law. Linda Duncan has worked on environmental law for 45 years. Over time, we have slid backwards, Duncan said. This was an opportunity to put in place, finally, a strong federal impact assessment process, and it's a missed opportunity. Duncan noted the Liberals have not turned down a major project since taking power nearly 3 years ago. And this law is not going to change that, Duncan said. Elizabeth May said that before 2012, 4,000 to 5,000 projects a year were screened through the federal process. After the changes of Stephen Harper with C-38, that number was reduced to closer to 25 a year. I don't think that's adequate, May said. Small projects not making the nightly news are sometimes the ones that need to be screened to make sure they're not having a negative environmental impact. Bill C-69 does not fix that problem, which May calls a tragedy. Between 1975 and 2012, only 2 projects reviewed federally were rejected. Other environmental experts gave the bill cautious praise after several amendments were made to improve it. But even they warned the devil will be in the details. The bill is far from perfect, but with these amendments, we feel more confident that Canada's new impact assessment regime will help ensure sustainability and avoid decisions that put politics ahead of science and environmental protection. That's from Anna Johnson, a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. Johnson said crucial amendments were made to ensure decisions are no longer made in a black box. The government has not released a draft list of projects that will be subject to impact assessment. Unless that list is significantly expanded, the Impact Assessment Act will ultimately do little to improve on the status quo and will not tackle cumulative environmental effects. Now, that's from Joshua Ginsberg, Director of Legislative Affairs at EcoJustice. The new laws will only be as effective as their implementation. Now, Anna Johnson said a good example of the amount of discretion allowed for in the bill relates to public participation. It says there will be meaningful public participation, but we don't know how often the public will be engaged, how long the engagement periods will be, how much funding they will have. So there's still a lot to flesh out in the regulations. Jamie Neen, Communications Coordinator for Mining Watch, said the amendments mildly improved the bill, but said there's a lot of wiggle room in there still for arbitrary decisions. Some of his biggest outstanding concerns include how often regional assessments, which look at cumulative impacts, and strategic assessments, which look at how policies like climate change ought to be applied, will actually be done, because they aren't mandated. Those kinds of assessments either won't happen or will be very limited in their scope, Neen said, pointing to the Salish Sea and the Gulf of St. Lawrence as places in need of regional assessments. Well, in fact, that was something that was in the Federal Court of Appeal decision against Trans Mountain. For Ms. Duncan, her biggest concern is that the amendments to include UNDRIP more prominently in the bill weren't passed. They talk a big line about signing onto international treaties, and then when it comes to actually instituting it in domestic law, there's no commitment. Most of our major resource projects are occurring on or impacting Indigenous peoples, their lands, and their waters. Duncan and May hold out hope that the bill may be improved in the Senate, with Duncan pointing to 4 Indigenous members of the Senate who she has shared her amendments regarding Indigenous rights. The ball is in their court now. Now, when they're talking about not adapting UNDRIP, they mean the commitment Trudeau made to put it into Canadian law. And then the Indigenous Attorney General said, no, we can't do that. Go figure. Ms. Duncan hopes the Senate will travel and talk to people across Canada before passing this bill. The Liberals had a golden opportunity to put in place a credible review process. So many people put their heart and soul into coming up with a strong law. Very little of it was listened to. What happens now? We'll see. The Senate is not the rubber stamp it was in the Harper era. And what's happened lately? Well, let's look at August 15th of this year. Saskatchewan and Ontario rail against Bill C-69 after Energy and Mine Ministers Conference, the middle of August. Delegates at the annual Energy and Mines Ministers Conference in Iqaluit released a communique that said, among other things, that the federal and provincial governments will work to ensure an effective regulatory review process that enhances economic competitiveness and maintains a sustainable environment. Greg Rickford, Ontario's Minister of Energy, Northern Development and Mines, and Bronwyn Eyre, Saskatchewan's Minister of Energy and Resources, released a joint statement Wednesday explaining their refusal to sign the communique. Wednesday's statement focused on Bill C-69, which is currently in the Senate. Rickford and Eyre's statement says the bill would hinder natural resource economic development for the country. The changes in the new Impact Assessment Act would result in a more complex, costly, and time-consuming process, while creating uncertainty that could ultimately erode Canada's economic competitiveness. Their statement also said that the provincial ministers are completely against a job-killing carbon tax. Okay, so what that says is the mine and energy ministers for Saskatchewan and Ontario, Saskatchewan Party Scott Moe, PCPO Doug fucking Ford, decided to turn it into a fuck Trudeau show. Good for them. It's almost a law. There are no regulations. You can write whatever you want. You can say you can behead people that don't get shit in on time. But when it's not written down, there are no rules. Guess what? Will the Senate say, we're not doing shit until we see some regulations? They could call deputy ministers, ADMs, even ministers to their committee and say, where are the regulations? Now, the reason I bring this up is, how does all this fit in with what the feds are going to do about Trans Mountain? We own it. We own the stricken permits. We own the whatever agreements there are with First Nations on the route. We own the permits from the BC government. We own the shipping contracts from the suppliers. At this point, I bet the shippers really wouldn't give a shit if it never got built and they didn't have to pay anymore. But this is all equity. This has to go forward one way or another. Nobody's going to buy it as a pile of paper that it is. The only way you get anything back for it is build it. The Federal Court of Appeal made it very clear how you do that. TikTok. Now, in the first show I did, I'll get this in before the show is over. The first show I did on C-69, I used a lot of information that was generated by a professor at Dalhousie named Meinhard Dula. He put out an article implications of the Federal Court of Appeal decision to quash the Trans Mountain approval. Of course, it was very, very straightforward. From a narrow legal perspective, the FCA decision in Tsleil-Waututh Nation versus Canada is about compliance with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012, the Species at Risk Act, and the federal duty to consult under Section 35 of the Constitution. Its implications are, of course, much broader. Even more than the Keystone, Northern Gateway, and Energy East pipelines, the Trans Mountain expansion project has become a flashpoint over economic, energy, and climate policy in Canada. On one side of the debate are those who continue to ignore the climate crisis itself and the social, economic, and environmental implications of a continuation of an economic and energy policy that is centered around the extraction of fossil fuels. The governments of Ontario and Saskatchewan, as well as conservative opposition parties in Alberta and the federal level, are clearly in this camp. A second camp in the debate would continue with the exploration of Canada's fossil fuel resources while making various levels of effort to decarbonize other elements of the Canadian society, such as electricity and transportation. Many in this camp have made their commitment to addressing climate change in other sectors, conditional on continued support for the fossil fuel extraction industry. The federal government and the government of Alberta are clearly in this camp, but so are other mainstream parties in Canada. Members of this camp have yet to demonstrate a commitment to meeting Canada's 2015 Paris climate commitments. A third camp advocates for the complete decarbonization of Canadian society as quickly as reasonably possible, including a transition away from the production of fossil fuels. This camp takes the view that Canada has delayed action on climate change too long to be able to implement an approach that separates the fossil fuel industry from the decarbonization of other sectors, and that nothing short of best efforts to decarbonize is an adequate response to the climate crisis we are in. This camp also points out that nothing short of this level of effort is consistent with Canada's commitments under the Paris Agreement. The recent Federal Court of Appeal decision is the latest step in a drawn-out battle over the expansion of this pipeline among those three camps. The court reached three conclusions that led it to quash the federal approval of the pipeline expansion project. It found that the federal approval did not comply with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act because the assessment failed to include the increased tanker traffic resulting from the pipeline expansion. The court also found the federal government did not comply with Section 79 of the Species at Risk Act in failing to identify mitigation measures to avoid or lessen the impact of the project on endangered species, particularly the effects of increased tanker traffic on an affected killer whale population. Finally, the court found that the federal government failed to comply with its constitutional duty to consult with affected First Nations communities by failing to engage in a two-way dialogue to seek to accommodate reasonable concerns raised by a number of affected First Nations communities. Now, considering that, what did I say about 40 minutes ago about, you'd think when they were writing this, they had an idea of what the court was going to do. You can also juxtapose pieces of the ruling of the Federal Court of Appeal on Trans Mountain into C-69. It's no surprise. Everybody knew it was going to happen. Now, the question I have is, was the Liberal government counting on some type of timeline coinciding for C-69 to become law and Trans Mountain is under construction and we're going to deal with the issues from the Federal Court of Appeal, just, put all that in the impact assessment now? They have to get this stuff done, as the court instructed, before construction can go. Do they do it as the National Energy Board, or do they do it as the Impact Assessment Agency? and handed over to the Canadian Energy Regulator. But we own it. So guess what? There's no timeline on that end. Nobody's demanding their royalty check. We just pay. We're taxpayers. We don't get shit for nothing. So nobody's talking about how C-69 is being steered with Trans Mountain. Nobody's talking about how Trans Mountain will be steered as far as Bill C-69 goes. Because, face it, National Energy Board is dead. If it's not dead, it should be executed after this court decision. If you give a shit about resource projects and the environment, keep an eye on this bill going through the Senate, even if your TV news won't. As I said, this is Season 9 finale. Shorter than usual, only 16 episodes in Season 9, but the calendar is the calendar. Next week, September 19th, Season 10, Episode 1. The view up here will look at the New Brunswick election. Week after that, September 26th, we'll look at the Quebec election. Season 10 on familiar topics. But that's it for tonight. Thank you for listening to The View Up Here. And we'll see you next week in Season 10.